would like to leave the floor to Representative Hawks, Timothy Hawks. By way of quick introduction, Tim holds a BA in political science from Brigham Young University. He has a Juris Doctor degree from Columbia University. He really has a lot of experience in water law and in water policy. Tim supports our cooperative with legal counsel, and he's also a state representative in Utah and has been so since 2015. And with that, Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Thomas, and hello, everybody. I think Thomas is going to help me by advancing slides as we go through. Again, I'm a policymaker, I'm a legislator. So in the state of Utah, we have about 104 legislators, 75 in the House and 29 in the Senate. And I've been in the House of Representatives for the past 8 years. So Thomas and I will do a little bit of a tag team. He'll go and then I go, and then he's going to come back in and talk a little bit more, and then I'll wrap up. But I wanted to talk about some of the initial policy efforts on Great Salt Lake. And I think before I even get into the slides, it's important to realize that for most policymakers, for most legislators, the Great Salt Lake was really out of sight, out of mind until about the last decade. So it was kind of an oddity that people didn't really pay attention to. I think that's a reflection of Utah population as a whole. Your average person really isn't thinking about the Great Salt Lake all that much. Now that's changing, and it's changing rapidly. But I want to go back and start about really talking about how legislators and policymakers began thinking about Great Salt Lake, and that's this first presentation. So if you could advance the next slide, Thomas. Thanks. So I say it starts with a setback, but you can see this graph is lake elevations for Great Salt Lake. And you can see that lake elevations increased from 1960 through the 1980s when they kind of peaked. And then you saw a couple of decades of marked decline in lake elevations. So it's a dry cycle, and also human use of water is increasing. And so we saw lake declines. And so in response, next slide, Thomas. There was a desire among stakeholders, including some of the stakeholders that Thomas was talking about, to have some sort of response to that. And so the idea was, hey, let's create a Great Salt Lake Commission. And in the United States, a commission is typically an organization or entity that's given authority from a legislative body. And they can actually do things. So they can pull different levers, they can make rules, they can do different things like that. And the idea back in 2010 was, let's come up with a Great Salt Lake Commission. But there was resistance to that idea. In the United States, sometimes we don't like to have outside entities have power and authority. And so instead of getting a Great Salt Lake Commission with legal authority, what came out of legislation in 2010 was a Great Salt Lake Advisory Council. And you could just think about the names. Commission, it implies the ability to act, whereas an advisory council is simply a group of people whose job is to advise. And so you'll note they don't have any policy or rulemaking authority. They really didn't have a budget. Their goal or their responsibility was created by statute, was just simply to advise the governor and to advise policymakers about Great Salt Lake. Now, on the positive side, however, it really did manage to pull together for the first time a bunch of stakeholders about the lake. So we had local governments, cities and counties participated. We had state agencies, Division of Water Resources and Wildlife Resources, and non-governmental organizations that are interested in the environment, for example, were represented, as well as the mineral industry and the brine shrimp industry. And so the council was able to pull together for the first time a lot of stakeholders with disparate, with wide interests about the lake. Next slide, please, Thomas. I know those slides will take just a second to advance, but again, it became a good forum for vetting issues. If there were concerns about the lake, sort of having discussions and then taking those ideas, whether it was to policymakers or to the public, there was some real value in that. And very quickly, the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council became kind of unified voice for the lake, where the spirit of the organization was people working together in consensus, not fighting about different things about the lake, but sort of working together for a common good and for the common purpose. And one of the key things that that council began to do was to tell the story of the lake and tell the story about the need to protect it. And so what you can see here, and I'm going to go through some of these studies in a little more detail in just a minute, but you can see that over the past decade or so, the council has started to put together a lot of very important reports that help educate policymakers and the general public about the importance of the lake and the resources and economic activity. Thomas, let's go to the next slide. So, Thomas, can you get that? Yeah, there it is. All right. And it's lagging just a bit, but it seems to pop back up. So one of the very first things the council did, and again, this is against a backdrop where most policymakers like myself or the broader public don't really understand the value of the lake. The lake kind of smells sometimes when the wind is a certain direction. It's kind of an oddity. It has these strange colors, but people don't really understand, well, why is it important? Why should I care about the lake? And so one of the first studies that the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council did was talking about the economic value. So they actually hired some professional researchers to estimate what that economic value was. And in 2012, so a decade ago, that value was about $1.3 billion in US dollars in direct economic output. So that's principally the most important mineral extraction. There are very important minerals that come out of Great Salt Lake, but also the brine shrimp industry, bird hunting, bird watching, and other forms of recreation. You can see that there's also benefits in that the lake allows us not to treat sewage effluent to its highest standards. And so there's some avoided costs there that benefit the citizens of the state of Utah. There's just some value, what they call passive use value of having this resource out there, almost 8,000 local jobs. But there was a lot of things that this report really didn't get into. It didn't talk about dust and the impact of dust on human health. It didn't really talk about the role of Great Salt Lake in the water cycle and whether that had value. And so there were some sort of topics left for another day. Go ahead, Thomas, on that next one. And so the second report that the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council did, and Thomas, you can advance information in this one, is to talk about the lake's health, really not from an economic standpoint, but more of an echo small font you can see there, but the colors are what matters. And so you can see that even at very low lake levels similar to where the lake is today, green is good and red is bad. So you can see, yes, there are some habitat types that struggle at low lake elevations, but by and large, when you look at the lake as an ecosystem, the lake is still healthy even at low levels. You see this, the green are for different types of, different types of habitats, and you can see that most of those habitats are still doing fairly well. And that was true in 2012, and that's still true today. Thomas, next slide. Okay, so we're going to jump forward about 6 years and talk about something that's important that happened in 2018. So that was by that time I was in the legislature. The Artemia industry pays a royalty to the state based on the raw harvest of Artemia cysts from the lake. But most of that money goes for things that don't have anything to do with Great Salt Lake. It goes for endangered species projects and things. But really, the vast majority of that money, almost 100% of that money, goes outside of the lake ecosystem. And so something that happened in 2018 was an adjustment to that said, listen, the lake needs money, it needs resources for additional research. And so can we take a portion of that brine shrimp royalty revenue, the royalty that's paid to the state, and use it to jumpstart research so that Great Salt Lake Advisory Council could fund additional research. In addition to all the GSLEP and and other research that Thomas was talking about. More reports, more awareness. So we saw that. And then we saw the hiring of a full-time Great Salt Lake coordinator for the state, somebody who could just be a point person and help manage information and talk to the media and talk to the press. And that release happened in 2018. And on account of that, we saw a significant increase in the number of reports and things coming out from the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council. So in the very next year, we saw the development of a model to sort of anticipate what was going to happen in terms of Great Salt Lake and its ecosystems and its water supply. That was this Great Salt Lake integrated management model, GSLIM model from 2017. And then in 2019, they actually ran models to sort of say, well, what's going to happen to the lake? And again, there's a graph behind here. It's not important that you understand every aspect of this graph, but the important thing that those models showed is that with modest conservation in the agricultural sector and in the municipal sector, it dramatically increased the chances that over time the lake would stay within healthy and sustainable levels. So you can see in that graph, there's a worst case scenario where it's hot and dry and people don't conserve. You can see the lake goes into these kind of critical red, sort of levels. But with all of these other scenarios, there's a very good chance the lake stays in healthy and sustainable levels. So that's a note of encouragement coming out of those studies. Next slide, Thomas. So then in many of you will be aware of this because of things that you're aware of, but it's something that people here in Utah are not aware of and don't think about. But one of the studies that GSLAC looked at was, well, what's happened with other terminal lakes around the world, saline lakes around the world, when their water supplies have been diverted for other uses. And so there was a report that went in and looked at the Aral Sea in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and what happened when its water supplies, what's happening with Lake Artemia in Iran. And then because Americans tend to dismiss things that are happening on the other side of the world, much closer to home, you can look at a small terminal lake in Northern California called Owens Lake. And Owens Lake is about a 1/20th the size of Great Salt Lake, but its waters were diverted to fuel growth in Los Angeles. And a ton of problems happened when Owens Lake went dry. And so this report goes through those lakes and some other lakes to sort of emphasize for people just how serious it is if a resource like the Great Salt Lake is lost. So the next one was to really update the 2012 economic study using contemporary economic data and also look into some of these other issues that the 2012 study didn't look at. And that updated number says that instead of $1.3 billion in economic value, the lake today is between 1.7 and about $2.2 billion in annual economic activity. And then the report starts to pick up on some things that people didn't think about, which is as the lake continues to go down, more dust blows off the lake bed. Well, what does that mean for the economic future of the state? It also looked at things like snowpack and what does that mean for the ski industry? And how does the lake tie into our water supply? What value does that have? Because some of that water that comes off the lake is recirculated in what we call lake effect snow. Typically, it's a snowstorm. It can be lake effect rain, but basically the lake itself can generate its own weather, and some of that water, that excess water, falls back onto the mountains and is part of our water supply. So this 2019 study updated that information in today's terms. So then a couple of other things happened. Again, in the late 2018, 2019, we're again looking at low lake levels at Great Salt Lake, and many of you may have seen different press associated with that. And so the council commissioned really two studies. The first was really a brainstorming effort to just sort of say, hey, what are some ideas? It doesn't matter whether they're crazy ideas. What are the ideas that we can use to get more water into the lake? And some of these ideas really were crazy and impractical. But the consultant that worked with the council came up with over 70 strategies, most of which were submitted by members of the public to say, here's how you can provide more water to Great Salt Lake. In the next year, that study was refined in 2020 by looking at the 12 most promising strategies in depth and asking the question, how can these strategies actually be implemented? And the good news, and one of the encouraging things, we'll talk about this in my later presentation, is that a lot of these recommendations are starting to be adopted today. Last two studies, and I won't spend much time on them, that GSLAC put together, but one is really talking about what are the impacts of conservation. So if Utahns, citizens of the state of Utah, get better at water conservation, what does that mean for the future of the lake? What does it mean for water supply projects and things like that? And the news there, again, is encouraging. So as people conserve more, then there's more water for the lake and there's more water for other human uses. The last study that was just completed last year deals with water reuse. So as it turns out, particularly in a dry year, about 1/4 or 1/4, 25% of the lake's water supply comes from sewage treatment plants. So they treat the water to a certain standard, and then they release that water and it goes down into Great Salt Lake. Well, there's a real question. As water supply gets tighter, then people look and say, well, what if we treat that water to an even higher standard and then we can use it for other human uses? If you do so, however, that has implications for the lake. And so the study in 2021 really talked about how we need to think about water reuse, and we need to think about sewage treatment water in terms of how it deals with the lake and its water supply. So that gives you a pretty good sense of the kind of reports and information the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council was able to put out there to help educate the broader public and policymakers about the lake, and to build the case that we need to act proactively to protect the lake and its future.